Hello and welcome back today where we revisit the Nevada Northern with video number 2. Don't want to miss it. Have you ever wanted to drive a steam locomotive? You can at the Nevada Northern. They have a special program where you can be the engineer, and there are some training steps you go through, and then you show up, and they have a supervising engineer that guides you through the steps and helps you not wreck a 100-year-old steam locomotive or a first-generation diesel, if that would be something you're interested in driving. It's a fantastic program. And as I was privileged to go through that, I thought it might be fun to share a little bit with those of you who are interested in some of the roles of the fireman and some of the roles of the engineer. And specifically, some details about what it takes to prep the engine, and some of the things that happen with each of those positions in relationship to keeping the engine going and the communication and all that. So that's what this video is about, and I hope you stick around and watch it. And as always, if you have comments or questions, please add those, and especially if you've had experiences driving a steam engine or firing a steam engine, either one, I would love to hear from you, and you can probably fill in some gaps. I'm sure I'm not covering everything there is to know. So please watch and let me know your thoughts today on Austin's American Flyer YouTube. So when it comes to operating a steam locomotive, there are a couple things that have to happen. One of those is there's a lot of manual preparation that takes place. And specifically, you're talking about lots and lots of lubrication points. And in the example that I'm going to share with you here, I asked Nick, who is a fireman and also kind of a hostler as well. He counted up somewhere in the vicinity of 100 different oiling and greasing lubrication points on the engine. Now mind you, these are places that have to be given regular attention every day, and some of them have to be given attention after so many trips or a trip of such a distance. So just that in and of itself means that steam engines need a lot of labor. Does it come in here?
can wipe down stuff like this. And then wet side on 40.1.2.
We put some, it's super lightweight oil. Our other two oils, journal and steam, really thick up when they're cold. This one doesn't.
Okay.
All I'm doing is just putting some in there. Make sure this moves freely.
45, 46, 47, 48.
So Nick, how many days a week are you here?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm here just weekends right now because I have class during the week.
Okay. What about it? What about in the cab? Did you count those?
In the cab, there's 1, 2. Very, very careful. And then just fill it right up until you see that grill in there. Yeah. Fill it up till that's covered. Oh wow. Okay. There you go. All covered? Yep, keep going. Keep going, keep going. There you go. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9, 10, 11, 12. 12-ish.
All right. So somewhere in the vicinity of 80 oil and greasing points.
Something like that. Perhaps.
Probably more that we have.
It's probably more. What do you know what this thick grease is made out of?
I can read the box for you when we get done. I don't remember exactly what it is. It's high soap base.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
High soap base.
So interesting. Okay.
The president at the Northern Nevada told me that for every 1 hour that a steam engine is in operation, and that can be just sitting still with the boiler, operating and steam pressure up, he says for every 1 hour that steam engine is in steam, he said equates to 3 days of maintenance. So again, it just highlights the fact that steam engines did require a lot of hands-on attention, and unfortunately that's one of the reasons diesels took over, because they take a lot less maintenance. So when a steam locomotive is being brought up from a cold position and getting ready for service, Nick told me there are some things that he as a fireman is paying attention to, specifically regarding the fire and the steam raising. So I wanted to focus in a little bit about those. For starters, most of us that are familiar with steam engines understand that there's a fire or some sort of a heat source that's going to boil water, turn it into steam. But one of the things you may or may not be aware of is the fire is in a firebox. And in the case of the number 93, that firebox is something along the lines of 4 feet wide and 9 feet long. I may not have my dimensions exact, but it's very, very close to that and very big. The coal must be shoveled into that space in such a way that the space is evenly covered. That means around the corners, front and back, and even across every place else. And Nick was telling me if I don't have coal across that space evenly, that gives me a fire that doesn't burn right. And so that was one of the things that as a fireman he's constantly watching. Even as the train travels down the road, as he's putting coal in there, he's checking the fire. Is the fire burning evenly across? Another thing Nick told me is, he said, I look at the color of the smoke. And he said, based on the color of the smoke, I can tell how the fire is behaving and if it's burning correctly. And I looked at him, I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, for example, if we look at the smoke now, it's yellow. Well, I looked at the smoke and I couldn't see any yellow. I saw gray, but obviously I'm not an expert. And so then Nick went and grabbed a bar that was at the back of the cab, and he proceeded to put that onto 4 different pieces of linkage that stuck up at the back of the boiler. And what those linkages were connected to were grates that are under the fire. And what Nick would do is he'd move the lever back and forth and would shake the grate. And shaking the grate allows any burnt coal and ash to sift down through the holes in the grate into the ash pan, which then improves the airflow and allows the fire to breathe better. And that was Nick's point. He said when the smoke is yellow, he says that tells me there's sulfur in the smoke. That means we're not burning very well. So that means the fire needs better air. So he went and he shook the grates. And that was something that I saw him do, again, at different times as we traversed down through the canyon and come back up. He would be checking that smoke and mending the fire or tending the fire and keeping the fire where it needed to be. And the reason we build the fire is to generate steam. So another responsibility that Nick had was to manually keep an eye on the pressure in the boiler. And as you might imagine, as the engine would move, it would use steam pressure. That would cause the steam pressure to drop. And so he'd have to make sure that he had a hot enough fire to keep enough water boiling to keep the steam pressure up even though it was being used. As you also might imagine, as the train progressed and steam was being used and water was being boiled, he would need to add more water. So here you see a cup idea or a cup looking device below his side of the back of the cab where water's coming out. And what that's showing you is there's actually an injector that some water came out, but a lot more of the water is being forced into the boiler, even against the pressure we are running at, which in this case is about 160 psi. The injector was able to use the steam pressure to push new water or cold water into the boiler. So that's another responsibility that Nick as a fireman had during our journey. But in addition to the fire, maintaining the fire, shoveling the coal, observing all that, keeping the boiler pressure where it needs to be, making sure there's enough water in the boiler, Nick also kept an eye ahead, and if we were coming to certain hazards along the railway, be it a blind corner, a crossing with a road, or possibly even just traveling through the freight yard or the yard at Ely, he would be ringing the bell. And this is a manual thing, and he had to keep pulling the string. And you also will see some video clips of Nick, in addition to doing all those things, he would hop down off the engine and he'd set switches as we needed to take different tracks during our journey. So the fireman has a huge responsibility when it comes to making sure this locomotive is going to keep operating the way it's supposed to. John, the engineer for our trip, is one of these personalities that you just absolutely love being around. The guy knows his stuff. He's been doing this since the early 1970s. He's not only been an engineer on other steam engines in other locations, but he's also was a locomotive engineer for the Burlington Northern on some of their diesel engines. So he's been around the block, so to speak, and just a wonderful guy. And he told me, he said, "Austin, I can teach you to run this steam engine in probably 10 minutes. And he wasn't joking. I mean, we had a very competent fireman in the gentleman Nick, and so that hard stuff was mostly covered. So the engineer had a fairly easy task of pulling some levers and blowing the whistle when he needed to. But then he went on to say, he said, however, learning this road, even the short distance we rode, which was 14 miles, he said, it would take me a year to teach you how to properly drive on this road, because it was not an easy road. It was a mountain pass with hills and curves and blind corners and crossings and grades. So just interesting to catch a glimpse of what it takes to be an engineer on a steam engine. So in terms of responsibilities, an engineer has the following things that they do. They're responsible for cylinder cocks. And cylinder cocks are found on the lever on the floor in front of the engineer. And what these do is these open a bypass that when the engine is first starting out and the cylinders are probably cold, it allows steam that has condensed back into water a short way to escape without damaging the pistons. And once the engine has been in motion and the cylinders are warm, the engineer shuts the cylinder cocks, directs all the steam from the cylinders after they've pushed on the pistons and done their work up through a venturi blast pipe that's in the bottom of the smoke box. This then shoots steam up through the smokestack and gives us that lovely chuff sound that most of us associate with steam engines. And so just to give you a sense of how that chuff happens, it's actually related to each push and each release of steam out of those cylinders. Another responsibility the engineer has is obviously directing the engine. Are we going forward? Are we going reverse? To do this, they have a reversing lever. And in the case of our engine here, this reversing lever is powered. So that means there's a steam piston that assists the moving, and it's very easy. You just clasp it and release the notching system, and you move it to where it needs to be. When an engine starts out, you want to have that notched all the way forward if you're going forward and all the way back if you're going reverse.
To begin with, the power reverse has to be all the way forward. Go ahead.
What this does is this changes the linkage positions on the side of the engine and allows steam to enter the piston earlier instead of later. What that does is it translates into more power. Think of a first gear, if you will, on a car. Shoving that reversing valve puts your engine in first gear. Once the engine is in motion, you want to bring the reversing lever back, and what you're doing then is you're releasing steam into the cylinder at a retarded position or a later position in its travel. And so what in essence that does is it uses less steam. It makes the engine more efficient, and there's still plenty of power, but again, you've shifted from first, second to third gear, or maybe overdrive is a better way to think of that. And all of that is very important for reasons I'll detail in a little bit. Another responsibility that the engineer has, of course, is the throttle. And in the case of 93, that big bar that came across, again with a notching lever that you'd need to pull and release, was a little bit interesting to operate. It had quite a bit of travel before we would feel the engine start to move. But then once the engine started to move, it was very touchy, I found out, with how much steam you were letting into the cylinders. And while I didn't have this happen, I observed other people who were in this program on their trips that when they would start out, the engine would actually spin the wheels because they had pulled the throttle out too far and it was letting too much steam into the cylinders. And this is why that was not a good idea. In addition, as you might imagine, to the wear and tear on the track, the wear and tear on the treads on the wheels, and the general hard operating conditions on the engine, it makes the job of the fireman more difficult. And John the engineer told me that there's this unwritten rule that as an engineer you want to do everything you can to make the fireman's job as easy as possible. And he said the best thing you can do is when you're operating a steam locomotive is you do everything slowly.
Should be good. If we do things too fast, it slows down his fire.
Okay.
That's a violation of the Sense of Humor Act.
Okay. Okay.
So if you're accelerating, you accelerate slowly. He said by doing that, I'm not causing a lot of drastic changes in the boiler pressure and in the way the fire's being having air drawn through it. So it helps the fireman stay really on top of everything. And as I mentioned earlier, steam after it's been used in the cylinders goes through a blast pipe and up through the chimney. That also increases the draft through the firebox. So if a steam engine is running hard, then it's causing a huge amount of draft to go through the firebox. And that can make the fire very hot, but it also changes how quickly the fire burns. So there's a lot of changes, dynamic changes that happen depending on how an engineer drives an engine. And all of that directly impacts the fireman. So John was counseling me, let's drive nice and gentle, and that'll make Nick's life easier, and he'll in turn make our job easier because we'll have all the steam we need when we need it. So I thought that was pretty neat. One of those things where the engineer and the fireman really are a team and they have to work together. Another thing the engineer does is manage the braking of the train. In my case, I was driving light, or in other words, just engine and tender. So I only had one brake lever that I used, and that was on the engine. So there are big brake shoes on either side of the driving wheels, and especially when I was coming back from where the engine turned around on a Y, it was more downgrade than anything, and so John had shown me how to use these brakes.
I was born and raised in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I grew up on the Reading and Lehigh Valley when they were still running steam.
Okay.
I'm 75 years old now.
Yeah.
I slowed down just a little bit. Now the damn thing's working again.
And brakes on a train such as this are driven off of an air pressure system. And so on the front of this steam engine, hung on either side of the smoke box, are two big steam pistons, and those are the compressors that generate the air pressure to drive the brakes. And so as you hear different video clips of this steam engine, you'll hear that clunk, 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 clunk. Those are the steam cylinders keeping the pressure in the brake system so that it's always ready to use. And what I found is even when I wasn't running the brakes, those cylinders would keep pumping pressure in. So my guess is just like a semi-tractor, there are some sort of relief valves in there to make sure that pressure is always being maintained for braking purposes. Another important thing that an engineer does is signal. And the whistle, that lever that came down, was a very important part of our trip. And there are specific ways that you signal using the whistle when you're approaching certain hazards. or if you're in the yard, or whatever the case may be. There's always certain ways that the whistle is blown that are universal communication ideas. And for example, even nowadays, if you hear a train entering a crossing, unless you're in a community that has outlawed the horns being blown, you'll hear 2 long blows, a short blow, and then a 3rd long blow. And that is the kind of signaling that tells you, hey, there's a train coming to this crossing. So that was one of the things I got to do when I was driving the steam engine, was blow that series of toots on the whistle. And one of the things that I loved doing was actually adjusting my position on the whistle to give it a little bit of a trill or a change in the tone of the whistle. One of the things I've always heard the engineers would do, they each have their unique style of blowing whistles, and so that was fun to do as well in the real world.
Okay, you're good. Where's your nails so you don't get crotchety?
Another thing that I was kind of surprised by is the fireman and the engineer are constantly communicating. Again, there are certain ways that they talk, but they're always looking ahead, they're looking behind, checking the road, checking, is it safe to go? Is there any obstructions? Is there any hazards? And they're going back and forth continuously on just the clarity of the roadway ahead. They're also watching, and there's more nonverbals where the fireman and engineer are going back and forth about the kind of speed that they're going and the power that's needed, the position of the throttle, how the steam pressure is and the fire and all that. So there's a lot of nonverbal things that are happening as well, but they're constantly back and forth, and so it's a really interesting teamwork that happens on a steam engine, something I just didn't quite expect or understand would be so crucial to have that good communication.